when a kid approaches something, an idea, a topic, an object, like a doorknob, they're coming at it from below. They're coming at it without those contexts that grownups have. And I don't really believe in John Locke, tabula rasa kind of stuff. But if you can think about that as a child is coming to queerness without any preconceived notions of societal expectations, heteronormativity, any of that stuff. They're coming at it the same way you would look at, why is the sky blue? They're looking at sexuality and love and affection and family in the same way. Why is that family like that? Why do you love that person? And these are just such fundamental questions that we ask when we're young that we forget about what that context, that lack of context, actually, we forget what that felt like.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Parenting Forward, the podcast helping you raise children with healthy spirituality. I'm your host, Cindy Wong Brandt. For those who attended my Parenting Forward conference in 2019, you've met today's guest, Linz Amer. They are the creator of Queer Kid Stuff, creating media for all kids with queer representation. What I love most about the resource they provide is that there might be abundant queer representation and resources for teens and even preteens. I feel like it's a lot more scarce for young kids like preschoolers or early childhood. And Linz and their pal Teddy speak to that demographic, which I think is so important. Because it's never too early to talk to kids about equality and to give them the tools and language to see themselves and to interact with the actual realities of the human beings they will encounter. So I had Linz on the Parenting Forward conference to talk about queer kid stuff. But since then, they've created a new podcast, which is also really up my alley. It's called Activist You. The episodes are interviews with youth and kid activists, and I'm so excited to talk to Linz more about this. Thank you so much for being on my conference last year, and I'm so glad to have you on the pod today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so talk to me. Tell me about your two main projects. Maybe you have more, but these are the two that I know of. Yeah, your two projects, Queer Kid Stuff and Activist You. Did one inspire the other? I feel like they overlap, like the ideas of queer kid stuff. I mean, queer kid stuff, it's advocacy for LGBTQ plus issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Activist You is just more general, any kind of activism, but specifically kid activists or youth activists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Talk to me about your dreams for these projects, how they overlap and how they interact with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started Queer Kid Stuff about almost 5 years ago now. And it had a very focused mission on bringing kind of LGBTQ plus queer representation to essentially preschoolers. So looking at the 3 to 7 range, I think it's good for an all ages audience. I think that, from babies listening to the music to grandparents learning new vocabulary, it really spans a wide age range. But when I was writing it, it's very specifically toward that kind of 3 to 7 early elementary preschool kind of age, really when kids are these kind of tiny human sponges that are walking around, really kind of pulling in all the information around them and starting to understand their sense of self, starting to develop an identity. So I thought, I had been studying theater for young audiences for a long time through my theater degree and wanted to kind of marry my queer identity and all the stuff I was learning about queer theory and gender studies with what I was doing in the arts. And I found that there just really wasn't any kind of queer representation, any kind of validation for kids or even exposure for kids to what queerness in, all of its definitions means, especially when it comes to different identities and different family structures. And so I kind of turned to the internet and started making Queer Kid Stuff. And we did 4 seasons of that. And that also started to expand out just from kind of LGBTQ plus identities. We started to get into ideas of privilege and intersectionality and kind of looking at wider social justice. I did the Earth Day episode and we talked about climate change. So it really started to expand as the seasons kind of went along. And I found that what was really needed was less of a kind of like queer specific resource, which I had essentially already created foundationally. There are only so many episodes you can do on how many queer identities there are that make sense to kids before they kind of like get into preteen, teen years where they're learning a lot more kind of intricacies of it. But I found that it made sense to start to kind of widen that lens. And essentially what happened is that in a nutshell, I was using YouTube as a platform, and YouTube just kind of sucks as a space for queer people, queer creators, and for kids creators. So I was at the intersection of that being not a great platform for the work that I was doing. And so I essentially decided to kind of forgo the web series. It still lives online and is accessible to anyone who needs it. And I've branched out into doing live performances of kind of like the queer kid stuff content, which is, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So it's virtual now. Most of those performances are virtual. But I essentially switched from creating this web series and moved the content over to podcasting, which I find to be just a much more friendly medium to essentially do whatever you want on a much lower budget and with much more ease. And essentially what I found is, with that widening of the lens of queer kid stuff, I wanted to kind of take that into this new space where I could create. And that's kind of where Activist U was born. So it's a family-friendly podcast. And what I do is essentially just these interviews with quote unquote inspirational kid and youth activists. So what's really exciting to me about that is that I really get to put kids in conversation with other kids. So I get to use this kind of platform that I built to uplift the young people who want to make the world a better place and use them as a model for other kids to look up to be change makers and to realize that you don't have to be, you don't have to be special. You don't have to be this incredible person. You can just be a kid, but you can also be an activist. And I think that that's my favorite thing that the podcast does, is really kind of get into the nitty gritty of like, what does it mean to be an activist? What do these kids' lives look like? What is the hard stuff and what is the cool stuff about being an activist? And how do you find out kind of where your interests are and then where your talents lie to be able to do something about the unfairness that you see in the world? Those are kind of the two things that I'm doing, and kind of continuing queer kid stuff, and then also this kind of new endeavor with Activist U.
That's so awesome. You're just totally singing my song about the kid activism stuff. Several follow-up questions. First, we didn't get to kind of introduce you. Maybe you can quickly just say, what your identity is, since you referenced it doing queer kid stuff.
Yeah, totally. So I use they, them pronouns. I identify as queer and non-binary, and I am an activist, a writer, a performer, a producer, and I make LGBTQ plus and intersectional all ages media. So that means web series, podcasts. I write a lot of scripts. I do a ton of stuff.
Yeah. So speaking of intersectionality, I feel like that's the thing, right? Like the idea behind intersectionality is that you can't talk about justice for, let's say, queer kids without also addressing justice for Black kids.
Absolutely.
And so I can imagine you started off wanting to speak specifically into the LGBTQ plus space, but it's almost impossible. And it would be almost unethical, right, to not also include these other issues that impact queer kids. And so, yeah, I can see how it becomes, it's just very organic that you would expand out into kid activists in general. And then I'm in the space of doing, right, justice for children as well. And it's really hard to stay focused because so many things do impact you, like justice for kids. You have to talk about justice for families and justice for families as adults. And so it's interesting how we have to figure out like our niche and how to speak into a particular space while, thinking about all these other things. But I totally agree with you that queer kid stuff, even though you're speaking to preschoolers, that it is very accessible to everyone because, like poetry, like if you can't say it in a few words, then it's very clarifying, right? So if you figure out how to explain a concept or an issue to a child, then it means you really understand it.
Exactly.
I feel like there's so much wordsmithing in like academic circles or even Twitter where like you convolute the issue with lots of big words. And it's a way to complicate something that's really quite simple, which is equality.
Yeah.
And so I feel like doing media for kids is actually a really clarifying work on some very complicated issues.
I think so too. And like when I write for kids, I took a playwriting class specifically for kind of like children's theater when I was an undergrad. And my mentor for that class, playwright Philip Dawkins, who's just brilliant, he said this phrase that just has stuck with me through the years. And he says to write from under the doorknob when you're writing for kids. And it speaks to just like really getting into, the context that a child is within. So, they're not looking at the world the way that adults do, because we have all of this context, we have all this baggage that comes with everything that we encounter as grown-up people, because those are things that we've probably encountered before. And, when a kid approaches something, an idea, a topic, an object, like a doorknob, they're coming at it from below. They're coming at it without those contexts that grown-ups have. And I don't really believe in John Locke, tabula rasa kind of stuff. But like, if you can think about that as like, a child is coming to queerness without any preconceived notions of societal expectations, heteronormativity, any of that stuff. They're coming at it the same way you would look at, why is the sky blue? Like they're looking at sexuality and like love and affection and family in the same way. Why is that family like that? Why do you love that person? And these are just such fundamental questions that we ask when we're young that we forget about what that context, that lack of context, actually, we forget what that felt like. And it's why I love kind of like stripping all that stuff away and really getting to kind of these simple ideas of like, if you ask a grown-up what is gender, maybe they'll go on to like, all these tangents about like gender reveal parties and like the binary and these words and ideas. And I'm like, no, that's not answering the question, actually. Gender is how we feel about ourselves. It's how we feel about walking through the world. It's how we feel about ourselves. And it's also how we express ourselves. It's how we position ourselves in society. And I think that is just like so beautiful to be able to take these like really big ideas and really big concepts that feel overwhelming to grownups and really just like kind of taking them down to their core. And that's all the answer that kids need, And I think that grownups go into these questions, I think a little overwhelmed by their own context and forget that kids don't have all of that. And we can be purposeful in the way that we help them shape that context that they then grow up with, which can, one, validate their identity if they end up being queer in some way, but it can also create allies. And I think that is just as important, if not more so.
I mean, I think of growing up as like, how when you go to the optometrist to get your eyes checked and they give you these big, bulky, awkward glasses, and then they put like different layers and layers of lenses to like check your prescription. I think growing up is kind of like that. Like we get a lens here, we have this experience and we get another lens put over it and then another lens to a point where, I guess the optometry metaphor breaks down because it makes you more and more clear. But I think sometimes we become less and less clear.
Yeah. Well, you can be seeing something different from someone else through like different lenses. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But it is amazing. I think once you have a new lens put on, you see the world completely differently. And it's really hard to unsee it. It's like once you have a new lens, it's very hard to take it off again. And I don't know if we should be doing that either. We change and grow. That's what growing up is.
Yeah, unless you're like in a cult. I feel like that's like the one.
Yeah.
I've been watching the NXIVM documentary recently.
Well, this audience knows very well about what it's like to have to undo the things we learned in a cult. But so I guess I'm trying to, because when you said we forget so quickly, and I'm like, that is so true. I feel like I encounter that all the time. We forget so quick. And that's why justice for children is so hard to advocate for, because we all forget how hard it was, how oppressed we were when we were kids. We forget that. And it's incredible to me because it was really hard. Like every single person we talk to, if we remind them of the experiences they had as a child, every single person can point to an example of how horrible it was. Certain moments of how they felt helpless, how they didn't have a choice. We all have those stories, but we forget it and we don't care anymore. We don't want to advocate for a better life for kids. And I'm like, why do we forget? And I think that it's because we get a new lens and then we don't undo it. We don't go back to that original lens of what it was like. And I love this doorknob thing. Thank you for teaching me that. I'm reminded of how some people say to sort of even the playing field or the power dynamic, we should get down on a child's level and look them in the eye when we speak to them, which is a really good idea. And so I remember being intentional about doing that, right? Getting down on a kid's level and looking them in the eye and talking to them. Well, once I got down there and after I was done talking to the kid, I looked around and I'm like, wow, the world looks very different from here. I saw how tall that countertop is and how big adults are from that level, but we're not down there very often. So that's such a good reminder, not just for writing for kids, but to just remember the perspective of a child and, and their powerlessness from that perspective. But I really appreciate the training that you receive to know how to speak to kids from under the doorknob. I think that's so good. So beneficial for kids and for the rest of us. So let's go back to talking about kid activists. You often ask them, right? Do you consider yourself an activist? So let's talk about that. Like you just told us you identify as an activist as well. Like what does it mean to be an activist? And how do you decide whether a kid is an activist that could be on your podcast,
Yeah, I think that for me, it's up to the kid. I'm not going to put that label onto someone if they don't feel like that's what they do. But I do think that being an activist is a lot wider. I think being an activist is it's a larger kind of overarching philosophy of how you live your life. As the term that I kind of like a little bit better is maybe change maker, is someone who sees injustice, unfairness in the world and actively wants to and does things to try and change that no matter what they are. And I think that something that's so important is, there's a lot of different kids that I've talked to on the podcast of like a kid who works with a couple different youth-led organizations, does like admin work for a couple of them, does a little bit of organizing work and like maybe aren't the face of an organization, but they're still a part of it. And so that episode I called There's No Such Thing as like a Small Activist.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. So there are kids that I talk to from this organization called the Butterfly Effect. They have other kids and they organize events where they make paper butterflies, or you can make them out of tin cans, like lots of different stuff you can make butterflies out of. And they use them as a representation of the kids who are detained at the border. And I think it's like 70,000 or something like that. And they're using art as activism. I've just recently talked to a kid who makes cupcakes and does a 1-for-1 model, like Tom's the shoes. So every cupcake that gets ordered, he also makes a cupcake and donates it to a homeless shelter in his community or another organization like that. And he's fighting for, food inequity. And I think it's just, you could be so creative in the ways that you're being an activist, but you also don't have to be. Like you can also follow those well-trodden paths of being an organizer working for a nonprofit. All you have to do is see an injustice in the world that you care so deeply about, enough that there's nothing else you can do with your life but try and change that inequality. And that's what activism means to me. And I think that's something that I kind of had to figure out for myself, especially as I was like in the beginning of queer kid stuff and like trying to figure out like, I'm just a queer person who just wants to make the art that I wanted when I was a kid. And that's really all it is. And I stumbled into the activism because what I wanted to do didn't exist and I had to forge a path for myself. And people were mad that I did that.
When people got mad at you, you felt like an activist.
Exactly. And I was like, okay, like I didn't train to be an activist, but like, I guess I have to be because of what I'm trying to do. And I don't think that it's particularly radical to sing a song with my stuffed teddy bear in front of a camera, but other people think it is. And that makes me an activist. And I think that was like a weird kind of coming to terms of like, am I an activist? What does it mean to be an artist and to be an activist? Like I worry for my safety, to be perfectly honest, sometimes as someone who, whose face is in the public eye to some extent about like going to protests and stuff. And so like, I can't always do kind of like the stereotypical activist things, but at the same time, I'm talking to these cool kids, I'm putting their voices out. So there are lots of different ways to kind of contribute in this moment? And I think it's so important to make sure that we're looking at holistically, what does activism look like in all of these different spaces? So to go off on a long tangent of whether or not I identify as an activist, I think the answer is it's complicated.
No, it's such a good conversation to have. And I feel like basically what you're saying is it's kind of a privilege to not be an activist, right? If you don't have to receive hate from people, if you don't have to encounter resistance, you're in a very privileged position in life. And you can say, oh yeah, I don't have to be an activist because things are working out well for you.
Yeah. I mean, I promise I tried other jobs, other career paths. I promise I tried. I got a lot of no's. I was unhappy in a lot of spaces. And I just figured out that like, this is really the only thing I can do that will make me happy.
Yeah. So if you think about it, like I was saying about kids and how I really believe kids are sort of in this oppressed role in society, I think that kids have to be activists, right? Like they have to advocate for themselves if they want to do certain things. They don't get to just decide a lot of times. They don't even get to decide what to eat. Right. And so like every day kids are practicing advocacy when they're saying, I don't want these peas. That's organizing. And I mean, I feel like my kids organize all the time against us. Right? Like they have petitions, they like conspire with each other. Like they think about, what kind of mood mom and dad are going to be in. And they think about what words to use. That's activism, right? Like those are strategies that actual organizers do. How to determine the right moment, what words to say.
Mm-hmm. They should go into PR.
Yeah. Yeah, they need to hire a PR. And they do, right? Grandparents.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, this is blowing it wide open.
Yeah. So I feel like I've interviewed some kid activists as well. And a lot of times I feel like they define it as inspiring others. So I feel like that's another definition I think a lot of kids maybe think of when they think, oh, if they can inspire someone else to do something, that's activism, which is a good definition. And the thing about that is you don't have to inspire a lot of people to be an activist. Like there's no number scale. So we all inspire people, I think, right? People are inspired by different things and different people. And so I feel like the inspiration definition of activism makes it very broad for anyone to be an activist. So I know it's kind of like asking a parent to pick a favorite kid, but is there an interview of a certain kid that you talked to that impacted you the most so far?
Oh man. It's so hard because they all are just like super passionate about what they're doing. And it's all like really interesting work. And they're all just like really interesting people. I think this was only my second interview that I did, but I interviewed Nepal Kiazolu very early this year, 2020, before everything happened. And she is the youth leader of the New York chapter of Black Lives Matter. And she's 19. She's like maybe one of the busiest people I've talked to on the podcast. And she just has like this incredible story of when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and she staged a one kid protest in her school, and she wore a hoodie and like, I don't think she went to classes all day. And she had one teacher who was a Black woman who supported her. And I think she got suspended at that time. And like, she really, outside of this one teacher, she didn't really have support. And my gosh, she has become a force to be reckoned with. And man, talking to her was just so cool and inspiring. And like, I mean, I was like, when I was in middle school, I was like this like confused little queer kid who just like didn't have any understanding who I was super awkward, was like in theater and like just like doing the school play and the school musical. I had no kind of conception of who I was or my identity in such a profound way. And I think she just like, she saw Trayvon Martin and she saw herself, and she saw where it was important for her to stand up for herself. And it was just really inspirational, but like, I don't think that word really encompasses it. Like, just like the amount of guts and like boldness it takes to just do that at such a young age. It was just, I don't even have the words for it. It was just really beautiful to hear her story. And like, that was before essentially like a revolution sprung up in, with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade, and all of this kind of like happened over the summer. I talked to her well before that. And it just like really, I've been trying to, I'm a white person. I do what I can to try and practice anti-racism, but to hear someone tell a story like that and talk about, racism at such a young age, and then to also kind of go back in my mind at when I was that age. And I mean, in a different time, of course, but like to think about like what my Black peers were going through at the time when we were in middle school, and thinking about like the fact that like there aren't a lot of people who generally do what I do in, advocating for social justice and particularly queer representation in public spaces for young people. And thinking about the fact that like I'm a white person and I have so much privilege that comes with that and my background. And like the fact that there are like very few people essentially like by my side on this path. And I don't think any of them are Black. And it just goes to show that if I had gone through the harassment that I went through, the obstacles on the road to where I am now, and I had that like added intersectional oppression, I don't think I would have persevered through it. I think it would have been too hard. And I can see why there aren't a lot of people of color who make queer work for kids, because I think that I had enough privilege to kind of like help guide me through and kind of push through into a lot of the spaces that I needed to find at least a little bit of support in. And I just hope that anything that I can do to help people of color, particularly Black folks, Black queer folks, see a world where they can also be making this work beside me. Like, that's so exciting. Like, to have, imagine a preschool show with a non-binary Black lead. That would be an incredible world. I would love to live in that world. And for like me to also like be on the air with that and to have all these different representations of what it means to be queer and it not just be the white person. Man, that world would be so cool. And I want to try and bring about that world, but I'm just a white person. There's only so much I can do. And all I can do is try and uplift other people's stories.
Yeah, I love the passion that I hear in your voice. And yeah, I think it'd be really cool if you did a follow-up podcast with that kid to see how they have processed this year at the revolution.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask her to be on season 2.
Yeah, that would be cool. Actually, I think for your podcast, it would be really neat to have follow-up episodes because kids change so much and the world is changing so quickly. Yeah, to just see kind of the path that they're on.
Yeah, that'd be super interesting. Giving me ideas. This is great.
So since this is a parenting podcast here at Parenting Forward, and we have this shared value of justice and activism, I'm interested in how these kids that you've talked to are raised that resulted in them becoming who they are. Have you noticed a pattern in the way that they were parented?
Yeah, absolutely. I have. I mean, all of these kids have incredibly supportive parents. And like they say that, but it's also just like so clear in even just the process of bringing them on the show. I mean, a lot of these kids' parents navigate their email for them, like their public facing. And like, I know what that's like to navigate an inbox that is public facing as like an activist, as a public figure. And the parents are the ones at the front line for the most part. I mean, I think there's like 1 or 2 kids I've talked to where like I was specifically talking to them and I was like surprised because like, I don't know, I grew up, I guess, with email, but it was a little different. I had my school email address and it was like enclosed in like the school's like system of emails.
Yeah,
I didn't have like a Gmail when I was a kid. And so like that is so foreign to me. But yeah, I mean, all these parents are like helping their kids set up interviews. And almost all of these kids and youth that I'm talking to are entrepreneurs. So it doesn't just mean that they're activists. They are also like actively business owners and people who are running businesses. And some of them are for profit, some of them are not for profit, which come with, each of those come with their complexities. As someone who is an activist and also an entrepreneur who did not study business in any way, it is a uphill battle trying to figure all of that stuff out. And their parents are there every step of the way for them. I mean, I talked to this kid, Ryan, who I think is like, he's either 8 or 10. I have trouble keeping track of the ages of the kids that I talk to, but he runs like a whole recycling business with his dad. Their parents are just so supportive, but not just supportive. They're very hands-on and actively like helping them pursue these things. Ryan, who like runs his recycling business with his dad, they don't just go to like do beach cleanups together. His dad must have like filed his LLC paperwork, must do his bookkeeping. There's so much that goes into helping your kid run a business. Like that is huge. That is huge. And also most of these kids are homeschooled. So like not only are their parents helping them set up these businesses or just being generally supportive, are a lot of times flying with them and traveling with them to different, speaking opportunities. And I mean, the kids who did the butterfly effect went to DC and met a bunch of senators, did all this press for their project. These endeavors are huge. I mean, support is not the word for it from these parents. It is an extra job that they're taking on as like CEO of their kids' enterprises.
Well, I like how it's a partnership a lot of times. And they're doing it together.
But yeah, I mean, I think that from just like so many different angles, the amount of support is just really incredible from parents.
When I listen to your interviews, I feel like a lot of time they'll openly just say, yeah, my parents helped me. But then I feel like I can see the parent support in not just when they say it, but like the way that they carry themselves and then they view the world. Like you kind of know, okay, you are raised with resources to be able to speak this way and to view the world this way. So like that support is subtle, but you can see how they've been given the space and the access to become who they are. I guess I'm trying to make those invisible things a little bit more visible so that we can imitate it as parents.
Yeah.
Like what are these parents doing exactly? And I don't know if the parents themselves will be able to say it. I think it's more of like a posture and an attitude and the way that they want their kids to engage in social issues, right? And to think about the way they can be change makers, like all those subtle things. I feel like it's there. Like I can see it and feel it. And I just wish we could codify it.
Yeah. The thing that comes to my brain automatically is kind of thinking about socioeconomic status. And I think that that is a cop-out a little bit because I don't think that that is necessarily true of all these families. I think that there definitely has to be like a certain level of comfort where they feel like they can take on, their kid's project, maybe a little bit of initial investment, maybe. But I don't necessarily think that all of these parents are at such a high economic level that they can be doing this for their kids. I don't necessarily think that that's true. I don't think that these kids are coming from like huge socioeconomic privilege because I think that that's the easy thing to assume. And I think that what it is not like an abundance of finance, but an abundance of care, an abundance of empathy that is coming from these grown-ups who, are maybe projecting a little bit of their lack of ability to be activists in their own lives and are helping their kids fulfill that. And I think that empowering young people to change the world that they're going to be in longer than their parents is an incredible way to take up activism. I think that parents have so much potential for activism just through young people. I mean, I am doing the most long game activism you can possibly think of because what I'm trying to do in the work that I'm doing is I'm trying to create a better generation that can then create a world that is better as they grow up. And I mean, I'm not going to see that come to fruition in my lifetime. And that is something that I am okay with because I think that the work that I'm doing right now is so important for just the future of humankind. And I think that that leaves a much larger legacy than me, getting a Nobel Peace Prize. That would be cool. but I think that it's so much bigger than that. Yeah, in terms of like the households that these kids are being brought up in, like, yeah, of course their parents are like trying to bring them to protest when they're kids. Of course these parents are teaching them about social justice. Of course these parents are trying to teach them about intersectionality to like the best of their ability within their identities and like their, willingness to look outside themselves and their communities. But yeah, I think that there's so much that these parents are doing, but you can't have just the parents, you have to have the kid with the passion. And I think it's about bringing those two things together. You can't have one without the other,
Right. I really believe in, that's why I mentioned the partnership part of it, because I think to say that, a kid is an activist because they are these really passionate individuals that just like emerge out of nowhere is not a right story to tell, because almost all these kids have had resources. They've had their parents, they've had other people. They are in a community that allows them to be who they are. So we can't strip that away from them. That's really unjust and it tells the wrong story. But they're also not just the result of their environment, right? They also have this individual agency and they have made choices and they have expressed their passion and for their cause. And so it's like both and I think it's really important that we tell the full story of kids and activism, that it is both of that, and to do the work with that understanding that they still need support, right? Dynamic and charismatic individual still needs all the support and need other people to help them. And they should have the autonomy to determine their own path, right? Like it's both of those things. Well, I really resonate with all that you're saying about the long game as well, because with me, it's the same. I feel like I'm doing the same thing. And I love speaking to parents because I think parents understand the long game because they have kids in their lives and they know that they can tell their kid to pick up their socks and they have to do that again the next day and the next day and the next day. And it takes a long time to teach a child something. It really does. It takes repetition. And that has such a parallel to justice work. Like it's not going to happen. One protest, one election. Maybe I shouldn't say that. This election will change everything, but not any one act. The revolution isn't just one day.
Yeah, it's accumulation.
Right. So yeah, I just think that the long game for a better world is really the wiser lens to think about activism. So
yeah.
Thank you so much, Linz, for the work that you do. Thank you for building this platform to give kids a chance to share their stories and their passions. And thank you for being here and helping parents understand a little bit more of what kids and activism is all about. Tell us where to find Activist U and to find your other work and where to follow you on social.
Yeah, totally. So Activist U, you can find wherever you listen to podcasts. It is activist, U, ! YOU spelled out. I have many regrets about the punctuation.
Does it not show up on search?
I think it's learned well enough by now to do it without the punctuation. But when I first started the podcast, I was like, oh God, this is a bad idea. But it's on social media. Activist U is Activist U Pod. You can find us. We're mostly on Instagram, but you can also check out my other work at Queer Kids Stuff on all social media. I also have queerkidstuff.com. If you're looking for me in particular, I'm Linz Amer, LINDZ Twitter, Instagram, all those things. Yeah, that's where you can find me.
Thank you, Linz.
Thank you for having me.
As always, if you've benefited from this conversation, please share this podcast with a friend who might find it helpful. And please consider supporting Parenting Forward, the podcast, on Patreon at patreon.com/Cindy Wong Brand. You'll be added to a private Facebook group where I show up live every week. And I would love to connect with you more closely in that space. And you can do that for as little as $3 a month. Hope to see you in there. Together, Parenting Forward.